In the final, collapsing years of the Second World War, as the Third Reich began to crumble from within, there were rare moments when individual conscience defied an empire. Amid the ruins of ideology and destruction, one German officer, an unlikely man of rank and restraint, quietly risked his life to save hundreds of prisoners. His name was Wilhelm Hosenfeld, a Wehrmacht officer who would one day be remembered not for how he fought, but for how he chose not to. In 1940, Captain Wilhelm Hosenfeld was posted to occupied Poland, initially believing, like many soldiers, that he was serving his country's future. But the Poland he found was not a place of victory, it was a land of fear. He saw civilians beaten in the streets, Jews herded into ghettos, and prisoners worked to death. His letters home grew darker, describing the cruelty that stains the soul. By 1942, Hosenfeld was stationed in Warsaw. There, he commanded a sports stadium and training facility, but what it became under his care was something else entirely, a place of refuge. Beneath the shadow of Nazi authority, he began to shelter escaped prisoners, Jews in hiding, and Polish civilians marked for execution. He used his position, his papers, and his fluency in bureaucracy to forge documents, grant work permits, and smuggle food into the ghettos. For every man or woman he helped, he risked exposure and death. Yet he continued, guided not by orders, but by conscience. As the war grew bloodier and more desperate, his superiors grew harsher. Executions became common. Mercy became treason. But Hosenfeld had already made his choice. He once wrote in his diary, "We must see the human being, not the uniform." What began as small acts of compassion soon grew into open defiance. When the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising erupted in 1943, Hosenfeld was ordered to assist in its suppression. Instead, he worked quietly behind the lines, helping survivors flee through destroyed buildings, risking court-martial and death at every step. He was a soldier surrounded by monsters, but he refused to become one. The irony was cruel. An officer of the Wehrmacht, an arm of the same force responsible for Poland's suffering, became a lifeline for those it sought to destroy. By 1944, Hosenfeld had already saved dozens, but his greatest act of defiance, the one that would echo through history, was still to come. By 1944, Warsaw was a city on the edge of annihilation. The Soviet army was advancing from the east, and the Germans, desperate and vengeful, prepared to make their final stand. The city's resistance, the Polish Home Army, rose up in a massive rebellion against the occupiers. What followed was one of the most brutal urban battles in history. Buildings burned, civilians were massacred, and entire districts were erased from existence. In the midst of that chaos, Captain Wilhelm Hosenfeld still wore his uniform, but not his allegiance. His role as a military administrator in Warsaw gave him access to warehouses, supplies, and official seals, tools he now used to save lives, not end them. He issued false employment papers to Polish civilians, listing them as essential workers under his supervision, thereby shielding them from execution or deportation. He bribed guards, diverted resources, and turned a blind eye to the fugitives who passed through the facilities he oversaw. Every act of compassion was an act of rebellion. When the Warsaw Uprising began, Hosenfeld saw horrors unfold that even he could scarcely describe. German troops leveled entire neighborhoods, killing tens of thousands of civilians. He later wrote in his diary, "We are destroying ourselves. This is not a war. It is a slaughter of the innocent." Amid that devastation, Hosenfeld's secret work intensified. He hid men in storage rooms, falsified rosters to account for the missing, and occasionally used his authority to block summary executions. He knew what discovery meant. Gestapo officers roamed the city like wolves. One suspicious signature, one careless word, could mean his execution. But he continued, even as the walls closed in. By late summer, Warsaw was little more than smoke and rubble. German soldiers executed civilians in the streets. Thousands were rounded up for deportation. The city was dying, and yet Hosenfeld refused to stop helping. He once confided in a fellow officer who shared his doubts, saying that, "The only duty left is to one's soul." In those last months, Hosenfeld became known quietly among civilians as the Good German. It was a dangerous title, whispered only in the dark. Even so, Those who survived because of him never forgot his face or his courage. But as 1944 drew to a close, the city fell. The uprising was crushed, and Warsaw lay in ruins. Hosenfeld's unit withdrew from the city, leaving behind little more than ashes and ghosts. He could not have known that the man he would save next would make his name immortal. As winter settled over the ruins of Poland, the war turned grim. The Third Reich was collapsing, yet its machinery of cruelty continued without pause. Millions still suffered, hunted by policies of extermination and hatred. Amid this chaos, Captain Wilm Hosenfeld remained stationed near Warsaw, assigned to oversee abandoned properties and logistics. It was dull work, yet it gave him something priceless: access. Every day, Hosenfeld used that access to do what he could. He helped forced laborers escape, falsified records, and left food hidden in the ruins for those in hiding. He was no longer fighting for Germany, he was fighting for humanity itself. In his diary, he wrote, "God gave us conscience, but here it has become a crime to use it." It was during this time in the dying months of 1944 that fate introduced him to a man who would forever be tied to his name: Władysław Szpilman, a Polish pianist who had once performed across Europe. Szpilman had survived the Warsaw Ghetto, the deportations, and the uprising. He was living alone in the ruins, starving and weak, hidden inside a bombed-out building on Aleja Niepodległości. When Hosenfeld entered that building, searching for supplies, he expected to find resistance fighters or scavengers. Instead, he found a man barely able to stand, emaciated, trembling, yet still alive. For a long moment, the two men just stared at each other, one in a German uniform, the other wearing the remnants of a prisoner's clothes. It could have ended right there, in another death. But Hosenfeld didn't reach for his pistol. Instead, he asked the only question that came to mind. "Are you a musician?" Szpilman nodded, and then, with shaking hands, he pointed to a broken piano standing in the corner of the ruined apartment. When Hosenfeld told him to play, the sound that came out was quiet, fragile, but it was music. The same music that the Reich had tried to silence, now echoing in the middle of destruction. That moment changed everything. Hosenfeld realized the man before him was not an enemy. He was what the war had tried to erase, a reminder of civilization, of beauty, of life before madness. He brought Szpilman food, a coat, and eventually even blankets and supplies. Each time he risked exposure and execution. But Hosenfeld didn't stop. When Szpilman asked what would happen if the Germans found out, Hosenfeld simply said, "They will not." As the front lines closed in and Soviet artillery thundered in the distance, the two men knew the war was ending. But for them, those days became something else, a quiet act of defiance against everything the world had become. When the Soviets entered Warsaw in January 1945, Szpilman survived. He owed his life to a man in a uniform that symbolized his people's destruction, yet whose humanity had survived the war. Hosenfeld had fulfilled his duty to his conscience. But his story was not yet over. When the Red Army finally reached the ruins of Warsaw in January 1945, the city was a graveyard. Its streets were silent, but for the crunch of boots over rubble. Fires smoldered in the distance, and frozen corpses lay in doorways that had once been homes. Amid that devastation, one man crawled out of hiding, weak, shivering, and alive: Władysław Szpilman. He survived because one German officer had chosen compassion over orders. But that officer, Captain Wilm Hosenfeld, had not escaped the war so easily. In the chaotic final weeks, he was captured by Soviet troops while stationed near Błony, west of Warsaw. To them, he was simply another Wehrmacht officer, an enemy to be detained, interrogated, and forgotten. What they didn't know was that he had saved not just one life, but hundreds. During the Soviet interrogations, Hosenfeld tried to explain who he was, that he had helped Poles, hidden Jews, stopped executions, even sabotaged German orders. But the Soviet officers didn't believe him. They saw only the uniform. They sent him to a prisoner camp deep inside the Soviet Union. The irony was cruel. The man who had risked everything to protect others was now helpless himself, lost behind barbed wire, sentenced not by guilt, but by history's blindness. Meanwhile, in a liberated Warsaw, Spilman returned to what was left of his city. He found his family gone, his home reduced to ash, his piano destroyed. But he was alive. And though he didn't know it yet, the man who had saved him was a prisoner somewhere in the East, suffering quietly in the ruins of another empire. For years, Hosenfeld wrote letters to his wife, to the Red Cross, to anyone who might hear his plea. In them, he spoke not of his suffering, but of the people he had saved. He hoped that one of them might remember, that someone might speak for him. But his words never reached home. His diary from that period tells the story of a man wrestling with despair, yet still holding on to his faith in humanity. Perhaps God sees the truth, he wrote, even if men do not. For 5 years, Hosenfeld remained in Soviet captivity, malnourished, ill, and isolated. No one in Poland knew where he was. The war was over, but the shadows it left behind still swallowed men whole. In 1952, word of his imprisonment reached Spilman. The pianist, now rebuilding his career in post-war Poland, immediately wrote to authorities and Soviet representatives, pleading for Hosenfeld's release. But by then, it was too late. Hosenfeld died that same year, in a Soviet labor camp, far from the city where he had once chosen mercy over obedience. He never saw his home again. He never knew that the man he saved had lived, or that his act of courage would one day echo across generations. But Spilman never forgot him. After the war, as Europe tried to piece itself back together, stories of survival emerged from the ruins, fragments of light in a sea of darkness. Yet some names, like Wilhelm Hosenfeld's, faded into silence. For years, no one spoke of him. His deeds were buried beneath rubble, bureaucracy, and the bitterness of post-war politics. In the Soviet-occupied territories, any mention of a good German was dangerous. The very idea contradicted the narrative of total guilt. Poland, scarred by occupation, had no patience for nuance. And so, even those who had shown mercy were remembered, if at all, as nameless exceptions, their humanity swallowed by history's need for simplicity. But history, like truth, has a way of resurfacing. Władysław Spilman resumed his music career, performing again in post-war Poland. He rebuilt his life from memory and silence, carrying the ghosts of the past in every note he played. Yet for years, he never spoke publicly of the German officer who had saved him. Perhaps it was grief. Perhaps it was the danger of praising a man in a uniform that had brought such destruction. It wasn't until decades later, in the 1950s, that Spilman began to tell his story in full. When he mentioned Hosenfeld, listeners were stunned. A German officer helping Jews in Warsaw? It seemed impossible, but Spilman insisted it was true. Slowly, fragments of the officer's life began to surface. Old testimonies, hidden diaries, forgotten letters. Each piece revealed a man who had fought quietly, not with weapons, but with conscience. He had helped a Jewish teacher escape execution. He had saved Polish civilians from reprisal shootings. He had given food and shelter to those marked for death. His compassion had not been an isolated act. It had been a pattern of defiance. In his wartime diary, Hosenfeld had written words that later historians would call prophetic. "We are fighting a war of madness. The shame of it will outlive us all." Those words, recovered years after his death, struck a chord in a world still grappling with the meaning of justice. How could a man who had served in the German army, the instrument of destruction, also be its moral contradiction? For decades, his name remained unknown outside a handful of archives. But Spilman never stopped trying to honor him. In interviews, he spoke not just of survival, but of the man who made it possible. He described Hosenfeld's calm, his decency, and his quiet defiance against a system that had consumed millions. "The day I met him," Spilman would later say, "was the day I saw the last spark of humanity in a world that had forgotten what that meant." And with that memory, the story began to return, slowly, quietly, like the echo of a song thought lost to time. By the early 1950s, Wilhelm Hosenfeld's name existed only in the records of Soviet prison camps. His family in Germany wrote letters for years, pleading for his release, but most were never answered. To the Soviets, he was just another captured officer, a symbol of the enemy they had defeated. He had been sentenced to 25 years of hard labor for alleged war crimes, charges that were, in truth never substantiated. His real crime was simply being a German officer caught on the wrong side of history. In the brutal conditions of the Soviet Gulag, few survived long. Hunger, cold, and exhaustion claimed thousands each year. Hosenfeld endured as long as he could. His health deteriorated, but his spirit remained intact. Even in captivity, fellow prisoners recalled his calmness, his willingness to share food, and his refusal to hate. In one surviving note he wrote, "They can break my body, but not my conviction that kindness is worth dying for." Back in Poland, the man he had saved, Władysław Szpilman, was rebuilding his career. The pianist became a symbol of cultural survival, his music filling concert halls that had once echoed with gunfire. Yet even as his fame grew, he could not forget the officer who had saved his life. He wrote letters to Soviet authorities, pleading for clemency for Hosenfeld, explaining what the man had done during the occupation. But the letters went unanswered. The political climate of the Cold War left no room for compassion. In 1952, in a remote prison camp near Stalingrad, Wilhelm Hosenfeld died, reportedly from injuries sustained under torture. There was no ceremony, no recognition, no farewell. His name vanished into the endless lists of the dead. It would take decades before anyone would find out what he had truly done. When the Soviet Union began to open its archives in the late 1980s, historians uncovered fragments of his diary, pages filled with moral anguish, compassion, and disgust for the crimes committed by his own army. It was clear that this was not a man who had turned a blind eye. He had fought in his own quiet way against the darkness around him. A Polish researcher, reading the diary for the first time, reportedly said, "You can feel his heart in every line." Meanwhile, Szpilman continued to perform, and each performance carried the weight of two lives, his own and the man who made it possible. In the audience, few knew that behind the music was a story of redemption buried under the ruins of war. In one of his final interviews, Szpilman said, "I survived not just because I hid, but because one man chose to act when others turned away." The world had forgotten Wilhelm Hosenfeld, but history was about to remember him again. In the decades after the war, as Europe rebuilt itself from ashes, the story of Wilhelm Hosenfeld lingered in whispers. It lived in letters tucked away in attics, in fragments of diaries smuggled out of Soviet archives, and in the memories of those he had helped. For years, his deeds were known only to a few survivors: Polish civilians, priests, and one pianist who owed him everything. In 1956, after Nikita Khrushchev's partial thaw in the Soviet Union, documents began to circulate that revealed glimpses of Hosenfeld's compassion. Former Polish prisoners wrote accounts describing the German officer who refused to obey certain orders, who gave food to the starving, and who intervened when others would have looked away. One testimony recalled how he protected a group of Polish boys accused of sabotage, convincing his superiors they were only scavenging wood. Another told of him sneaking bread to forced laborers at night. Each account painted the same picture: a man quietly fighting against the cruelty of his own system. But for most of the world, his name still meant nothing. There were too many stories, too much pain, and too little appetite to humanize the enemy. Germany, still struggling with its guilt, wanted to move forward. Poland, still haunted by occupation, wanted to forget. It wasn't until 1998 that Hosenfeld's name returned to public attention, when Władysław Szpilman's memoir, The Pianist, was republished. In its final pages, Szpilman described the officer who had found him starving in the ruins and helped him survive. The book sold worldwide, and for the first time, readers learned about the German who had risked everything to do what was right. Historians began to dig deeper, uncovering his diary, family letters, and military records. What they found was extraordinary. Hosenfeld had written not as a soldier, but as a man tormented by what he saw, condemning the Nazi leadership, the SS, and the destruction of innocent lives. His words spoke of guilt, empathy, and moral struggle. He wrote, "Every day I live among madness. I see people turned into beasts, and I fear what we have become. If I can save one life, perhaps I can save my soul." These writings changed how historians viewed him. He was no longer just a kind German officer. He was a man of conscience who chose humanity in a world that demanded obedience. His story revealed that not every soldier in a gray uniform was lost to hatred, that even amid evil, some still dared to be good. In 2002, when The Pianist was adapted into a major film by Roman Polanski, the world finally saw his story on screen. Though brief, Hosenfeld's portrayal struck audiences deeply. Viewers saw not just an officer, but a man, weary, decent, and trapped by duty, who extended mercy where it mattered most. The world began to ask, who was he really? By the early 2000s, researchers and families from both Germany and Poland had begun to piece together the fragments of Wilhelm Hosenfeld's life. His letters home, hidden for decades, offered an intimate window into his transformation, from a loyal German officer to a quiet dissenter of the Nazi regime. In his letters to his wife, Hosenfeld described his horror at what he witnessed in occupied Poland. The deportations, the executions, the way entire communities vanished overnight. We Germans, or he wrote, have done things that will not be forgiven for centuries. I try to help where I can, but it feels like throwing a stone into a storm. Those letters revealed a truth few dared to speak aloud during the war, that not every German believed in Hitler's madness. Some resisted not with guns, but with compassion, small acts of rebellion carried out in silence. The more historians uncovered, the clearer his defiance became. He had used his authority to forge papers, hide civilians, and protect those targeted by the Gestapo. Each time he intervened, he risked not only his rank but his life. Yet remarkably, he continued. When the Germans began withdrawing from Warsaw in late 1944, Hosenfeld could have returned home safely. But he chose to stay behind, helping wounded civilians and captured soldiers. For him, duty had changed its meaning. It was no longer obedience to the Reich, it was service to humanity. Even in Soviet captivity, Hosenfeld's sense of morality never faded. Letters smuggled from his prison cell show a man still haunted, but never broken. He wrote, "Perhaps I did too little. Perhaps one man can never do enough, but I will not regret what I have done, even if I die here." To his wife, he sent messages filled with longing, but also calm acceptance. He did not ask for freedom, he asked only that the truth of his actions someday be known. And slowly, that truth began to emerge. Survivors spoke his name. Families he had saved passed down his story. In Poland, some referred to him as the good German of Warsaw. He had no monuments, no medals, no grand recognition. But to those who remembered, he symbolized something far greater, the possibility of conscience amid cruelty. By the time the world rediscovered Wilhelm Hosenfeld, decades had passed since his death. Yet his words, preserved against time and hatred, still echoed with simple power. A man is only as good as what he does when no one is watching. His story was no longer just history. It was a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of war, light could still exist in the heart of one man. As the Cold War drew to a close, archives began to open across Eastern Europe. Hidden among Soviet files, a series of reports from a prison near Stalingrad revealed fragments of Wilhelm Hosenfeld's final years. They described a man who never stopped helping, even within the brutal confines of captivity. He tended to the sick, taught fellow prisoners to read, and shared what little food he had. One Soviet guard wrote, "The German officer Hosenfeld does not behave like the others. He never speaks of victory or defeat. He speaks only of decency." Even among enemies, his integrity left an impression, but his health deteriorated quickly. Years of malnutrition, exposure, and harsh conditions took their toll. Despite multiple appeals by Polish survivors who knew of his deeds, the Soviet authorities refused to release him. They saw only a German officer, not the man who had risked his life to save others. In 1952, after nearly 7 years in captivity, Wilhelm Hosenfeld died in a Soviet prison camp. There was no ceremony, no grave marked with his name, only a short entry in a military record. Deceased. Cause, injury, and illness. Yet the people he saved kept his memory alive. Years later, Władysław Szpilman, the pianist whose life Hosenfeld had saved, told journalists that he owed his survival entirely to that German officer. His memoir, The Pianist, and later the film adaptation, brought Hosenfeld's name back into the world's consciousness. Millions learned of the man who defied his own army to protect life. For many, Hosenfeld's story represented something rarely spoken about in the narrative of war: the moral courage to disobey. He did not fight with bullets or propaganda, but with compassion. In the machinery of destruction, he chose to be human. In 2007, after decades of research and testimony, Yad Vashem, Israel's official Holocaust memorial, posthumously recognized Wilhelm Hosenfeld as righteous among the nations. His family accepted the honor on his behalf. For a man who had lived quietly and died forgotten, history had finally found its voice. Today, his legacy endures not in stone or steel, but in the stories of those he saved and the generations that followed. He had no reason to act with mercy, only the will to do what was right. In a world consumed by division and hate, Hosenfeld proved that even a single act of compassion can echo across history. And perhaps in his final moments, that was all he wanted: to know that he had done something, however small, to remind mankind of its own humanity. Time has a way of erasing faces, names, and even the memory of courage. Yet some stories, like that of Wilhelm Hosenfeld, resist disappearance. They linger quietly, waiting to be rediscovered. In the decades after the war, as survivors rebuilt their lives and Europe tried to heal, Hosenfeld's name surfaced in letters, memoirs, and whispers of gratitude that refused to fade. One such letter came from Władysław Szpilman himself, written in 1950 to Hosenfeld's wife. In it, he described the officer who had found him in the ruins of Warsaw, starving, terrified, and alone. Szpilman recalled how Hosenfeld brought him food, clothing, and hope when the city around them had turned to ash. "He was the only German I ever met," Szpilman wrote, "for whom I did not feel fear." That letter became the first spark of recognition. More followed from others: Polish civilians, former prisoners, even French forced laborers, all testifying to acts of mercy carried out in secret by a man who could have chosen silence. Historians would later uncover his diary, written in fragments during the war. Within its pages, he condemned the brutality of his own army, described his growing horror at the atrocities committed in occupied Poland, and confessed that he no longer believed in Germany's cause. "We are destroying ourselves," he wrote, "and what will be left of our souls when this is over?" Those words revealed not only a soldier's disillusionment, but a conscience awakened in the darkest of times. In 2007, when Yad Vashem honored Hosenfeld as righteous among the nations, his name joined a list of those who had risked everything to save others. Yet even this recognition could not capture the quiet enormity of his actions. Unlike generals or politicians, his legacy was not measured in victories or territory, but in lives spared, in hope restored. Modern scholars often call him the Good German, but such a label oversimplifies his story. Hosenfeld was no hero by design. He was a man who saw horror and simply refused to look away. In doing so, he showed that morality does not vanish in war. It only becomes harder to see. His story stands as a quiet monument, not of power, but of humanity. Amid chaos, one man proved that decency could still exist, that conscience could still triumph over obedience. For the hundreds who lived because of him, Hosenfeld was more than a name in a diary. He was proof that compassion can survive even in the heart of war. And so the story of Wilhelm Hosenfeld reminds us of a truth far older than any battle: that courage is not the absence of fear, but the presence of empathy. Because in the end, it was not an army that saved those lives. It was a single man who refused to stop being human. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.